I mean, Kelvin's work on Coleridge, Kelvin's work on Keats, and of course, Kelvin's work on Shelley, and in particular the Shelley edition, which we were hearing earlier this afternoon, is finally nearing port, having been launched, of course, by Geoffrey Matthews, who is Kelvin's supervisor back in, when was it, Michael, you said?
1066.
62, I think, actually.
It certainly wasn't 62.
But what some of you might not know, those of a younger generation, is that Kelvin, all the way through his career, has been a great facilitator of other people's careers and of the process of Romantic studies and indeed English literature in general. I mean, he's the human face of the QAA for a start, and he, of course, was the mover and shaker behind the Recollection conferences on Shelley in the 1970s, and at Recollection they even let some other Romantic poets in, even Byron got in there somehow. But it's difficult, I think, to overemphasize how important they were in the revitalization of Romantic studies. And everybody who was anybody then was at them, but much more importantly, all the people who are there now were at them. A whole series of youngsters who were as Kelvin was, I think, when it started, still actually a student. Still,
I was 6, I think.
Yeah. But they were really very, very special occasions, and we owe him a great debt of gratitude for that kind of work, as well as for his own work. The Shelley edition I've always loved for its kind of straightforward approach. This afternoon we had the two rival Shelley editions sitting not in the blue corner or the red corner, but together actually on the same panel. Wasn't always like that, I remember, back in Recollection days. Kelvin was never a man for intellectual safe space, or indeed any kind of safe space, really. But I'm sure today, in the best possible sense, it's still the same. No intellectual safe space here. A lot of excitement. Kelvin.
Just before I start, a couple of prefatory remarks. So I feel honoured, but also a little bit intimidated and embarrassed, I have to say, to be coming between the two other plenaries, because I think we all know that Nora has to be the most distinguished scholar of Shelley that we have at the moment. And I think we also all know that our best literary critic of Romanticism is Michael O'Neill. So they're both better than me, and in both directions. So I just wanted to get that off my chest. Okay? I mean, I'm not saying they're perfect. Have you looked at his edition of? No. Okay, that's enough about us. Let's talk about me. I've tried to shape this talk to the nature of the occasion. It's called The Heart's Echoes. In a recent essay, Timothy Morton notes how the tropes and topics of Queen Mab are elaborated and repeated throughout Shelley's career. That's true. But Tim Morton prefaces his point as follows. Who, on average, changes that much between the ages of 19 and 30? And my first response to that rhetorical question when I was reading is, most people change an awful lot between 19 and 30. But it's an interesting question in Shelley's case. The early intellectual fearlessness, that fiercely radical personal independence, and the recklessness was progressively chastened and quietened. It was chastened by the dreadful events of late 1817, suicides of Fanny Imlay and Harriet Shelley, chastened by the sense of personal and artistic failure, growing by steady increments thereafter, reinforced especially after the deaths of Clara and William, and the growing estrangement from Mary, health worries, the repeated disappointments of the reception of his work, not least in contrast with Byron, and the vexing matter of his relationships with other women, and especially with Jane Williams in the last months. At the same time, his sense of humour becomes ever more apparent and more engaging, and a sort of wry self-awareness and even self-mockery come through, stronger with each passing month. In the final weeks, we find him joking with Leigh Hunt about turning for comfort to veal chops. He was only 29 when he died. Studying any period in his last 10 years, that often seems almost incredible. There's a distinctive Shelleyan intensity of intellectual engagement, constantly driving on through new reading, new languages, new thinkers, new writing, and indeed new personal turmoil, all of it in a process of immensely complex consolidation with what's gone before, the journeys that his mind had already been on, overlaying or underpinning each new departure. Shelley is a difficult writer to study because of the challenge presented by that tireless energy of his intellectual seriousness. No matter which period or moment in that brief 10 years comes into focus, there seems more going on in reach of knowledge and understanding than can easily be quantified, let alone fixed in decisive analysis. There aren't many English poets who offer that kind of challenge. The perpetual change makes it all but impossible to locate intellectual artistic commitment or artistic commitments and think of them as settled. But, bound up with that unceasing intellectual development, Tim Morton is right to discern a certain continuity. Shelley's past seems forever to be catching up with him. The scenario of a mysterious assailant, the unflagging pursuit by agents of his deepest enemies, his father, Eliza Westbrook, recurring medical problems, sad entanglements with terrible outcomes involving children and lovers. Similar scenarios are reenacted with varied elements, different people, places, plot elements. The onward rush of Shelley's life is characterised by elements that repeat echoingly. The notion of repetition is indeed something that knits together the forward narrative, inviting comparison between moments, bringing a paradoxical stillness to the continuous rapid movement. His poetry is itself like that, not least in its most purely formal characteristics. The triumph of life, for example, is structurally a series of visions, similar in character and narrative, each one nested within the vision preceding, such that each new phase in the narrative turns out a fresh rehearsal of what's already happened. The terza rima continually reinforces that effect, each tercet a split couplet that takes off from the middle rhyme of the tercet preceding and itself introducing a new rhyme element to be taken up in the tercet following. The endless echoing variation within repetition of poetic rhyme is, of course, a peculiar strength in Shelley's poetry. I'm going to take the case of The Cloud from the 1820 volume. There is a handout. I don't know whether there have been quite enough, but hopefully you can share if you can't get to it. So all the passages I discuss in detail are on the handout. So we look at The Cloud, a poem which is an exhilarated celebration of perpetual self-renewal and self-invention within a repeating cycle. The Cloud's got 84 lines in 6 stanzas. The first and last stanzas each of 12 lines, the second of 18, and the other 3 all of 14. A shape prompting us, as Shelley's rhyme schemes, stanza forms often do, prompting us to speculate that symmetry is posited only to be avoided. In that, as in other formal respects, The Cloud, like so many of Shelley's lyrics, never seems quite to settle to the discipline that nevertheless makes it possible. I'm going to quote the 4th stanza. That orbed maiden with white fire laden, whom mortals call the moon, glides glimmering o'er my fleece-like floor by the midnight breezes strewn. And wherever the beat of her unseen feet, which only the angels hear, may have broken the woof of my tent's thin roof, the stars peep behind her and peer, and I laugh to see them whirl and flee like a swarm of golden bees, when I widen the rent in my wind-built tent till the calm rivers, lakes and seas, like strips of the sky fallen through me on high, are each paved with the moon and these. The overall movement drives forward through an underlying anapestic beat in alternating long and shorter lines, though here, as throughout the poem, the alternation is ceaselessly various, with longer lines ranging between 12 and 9, or in one case 8 syllables, and the shorter lines varying between 9 and 6 syllables. One is tempted to say that the line lengths are overdetermined by a basic pattern of strong stresses, alternating 4 strong and 3 strong, suggesting Coleridge's metrical experiment in Christabel. But like the syllable counts, that pattern of alternating 4 and 3 stresses is itself subject to so much variation that it amounts to a formal principle present only as it may be extrapolated from what actually happens or exists. Like Shelley's concept of an intellectual beauty or a power in nature or in history, nowhere directly apprehended, but inferable as the moving cause of what is present to the senses. The anapestic movement of the cloud, disturbed by numerous substitutions of feet, shortened lines, and additional unstressed final syllables, is in the stanza just quoted, characterised additionally by a sequence of lines ending with clusters of 3 strong stresses: white fire laden, fleece-like floor, unseen feet, tent's thin roof, wind-built tent. To characterise that rhythmic effect, you almost want to reach for a jazz analogy. It's like a drummer running an elaborate syncopation, which is nevertheless compatible with the implied time signature. The cloud also offers the Shelleyan challenge of formal complexity combined with fast movement, and intricate lines of thought and reference articulated through multiple metaphors and vibrant visual detail. Most remarkably typical of all is that controlled fluency, giving a kind of headlong glee in the cloud's self-celebrating self-description, which through the brilliance of the writing, of course, becomes at the same time a self-celebrating self-description of the poetry and its poet. The brilliance is partly made out of echoes. Echoes of poetic commonplaces, mainly classical, touched just glancingly, cumulus clouds as fleece, the sky mirrored in still water, and then there's quasi-scientific detail. The moon is white because it has no atmosphere to refract light. These echoes invite us to pause on an allusion or a reference to some thing or some thought preceding or outside the verse itself, even as we are rushed on by the intricate fast play of the rhythm against that elusively shifting metrical pattern. The actual meaning can seem all but subordinated to that spectacularly fluent rhyming. The rhymes, even for Shelley, are extraordinary in this poem. Through each of the stanzas, varying as they do in length, the pattern is an alternation between the odd-numbered lines, which rhyme only internally and never with any other line, and the even-numbered lines that rhyme with perfect consistency in successive pairs or sometimes triplets. The headlong and exuberant freedom with which Shelley negotiates that discipline makes for a most beautiful effect of complexity effortlessly mastered. Another concurrent dimension of that mastery is in Shelley's syntax. Threading perilously through the whole length of the packed sentence, filling all 14 lines of the quoted stanza, it brings us up short with that final dislocated pronoun, these. Its fugitive referent needs the pause afforded by the stanza break so that we can gather it is in fact the strips of the sky, reflected like the moon in the still waters of the earth. Those strips of the sky that the cloud describes as fallen through me are sharply observed. Areas of starry sky among moving broken cloud that reflect on the calm surface of the sea. But equally typical is the familiarity of that image. It connects with a passage in the Ode to Liberty, which is the adjacent poem to the cloud in the 1820 volume, where the image of ancient Athens is reflected within the surface of time's fleeting river. Those lines themselves rework at least two other draft fragments, including the beautiful lines Nora mentioned this morning that Mary called Evening Ponte Amare Pisa. The image of sky reflected in water, phrased to suggest the created effect of a perfected version of over-canopying reality, goes back to Lucretius, and there are a number of contemporary poetic instances that were well known to Shelley, in Wordsworth, for example, and Southey. It represents one instance of Shelley's ubiquitous tendency to return again and again to certain poetic conceptions, images, ideas, and specific words with a symbolic charge, which is relatively consistent. This quality knits together all of the output from Queen Mab to the Triumph of Life. Amongst the papers that Geoffrey Matthews left behind after his sudden death was a notebook containing his work on what was effectively to be a glossary of this recurring symbolic language in Shelley's poetry. It testifies powerfully to the persisting consistency of a wide variety of symbols and ideas in Shelley. Geoffrey had the firm intention of publishing this glossary as an appendix to the Longman edition. Sadly, as it turned out, the appendix itself proved one of the many obstacles to his completing work on the whole edition, as the list of symbols and their associated vocabulary grew ever longer. Geoffrey's work on the edition was a bit like Tristram Shandy, so he found out more new stuff in any given day than he'd covered, so far. That vision of a world purified and perfected in its reflection recurs in the last phase of Shelley's career. I'm going to quote now. We paused beside the pools that lie under the forest bough. Each seemed as 'twere a little sky gulfed in a world below. A firmament of purple light which in the dark earth lay more boundless than the depth of night and purer than the day, in which the lovely forests grew as in the upper air, more perfect, both in shape and hue, than any spreading there. There lay the glade, the neighbouring lawn, and through the dark green wood the white sun twinkling like the dawn out of a speckled cloud. Sweet views, which in our world above can never well be seen, were imaged in the water's love of that fair forest green, and all was interfused beneath with an Elysian glow, an atmosphere without a breath, a softer day below. Like one beloved, the scene had lent to the dark water's breast its every leaf and lineament with more than truth expressed, until an envious wind crept by, like an unwelcome thought, which from the mind's too faithful eye blots one dear image out. These lines from To Jane, the Recollection, embody much of what characterises the poems to Jane Williams as a group. The thought is deceptively involved, carried as it is in that calm voice, at once intimately personal and dreamily abstracted, where the challenge of the metre and the quatrain rhymes are met with a relaxed certainty, a subtle mix of varied pauses and run-on lines that makes speaking in verse seem more natural than speaking in prose. And yet the image itself is hard to grasp. The water is in love with what it reflects, and that is why the image it carries seems perfected. Like one beloved, the scene had lent to the dark water's breast its every leaf and lineament with more than truth expressed. The obliquity of this reference to Shelley's feelings for Jane is matched by the veiled reference to Mary's shadowing presence on the walk commemorated in the poem, where the idealising image is broken up by ripples from an envious wind. In the period towards the end of his residence in Pisa, with its tight community starting to break up under the pressure of fraught relations and re-emerging tragedies, Shelley seems to have come increasingly to try and find a measure of calm, even happiness, by thinking of his experience as confined to the present moment, looking neither back nor to the future, islanded in the moment. In March 1822, he wrote to Claire Clairmont, seeking to comfort her agonies of anxiety about her daughter Allegra, shut up in a convent by her father Byron, by urging her, and this quote is on the handout, urging Claire to give up this idle pursuit after shadows and temper yourself to the season. Seek in the daily and affectionate intercourse of friends a respite from these perpetual and irritating projects. Live from day to day. Attend to your health, cultivate literature and liberal ideas to a certain extent, and expect that from time and change which no exertions of your own can give you. In another letter, he advised her to think and act without a plan and let the world pass. And yet these longed-for islands of serenity in a sea of troubles again strike us as familiar. There are repetitions of personal circumstance, the turn from Mary to another woman, an alternative reality that seems half flesh, half embodied ideal in Shelley's understanding of this, the other woman. And it's not simply images and ideas which repeat, but also their poetic expression. The metres of the poems to Jane Williams are clearly influenced by Shelley's current reading in 1822, songs from The Tempest, and I think especially the metre of Prospero's epilogue to The Tempest, also the spirit speeches in Comus. And he was obviously reading a lot of Elizabethan and 17th century poetry at this time, people like Drayton and Herrick. But there are echoes of earlier Shelleyan metres as well, notably the 7-syllable movement of lines written among the Euganean hills, with its corresponding yearning for islands of refuge in the wide sea of misery. That metre suggests other couplet or quatrain rhymed short lines that we recall from choruses of Prometheus Unbound, or the stanzas written in Dejection near Naples, and the lines that Medwin titled Invocation to Misery. There is what one might characterise as a multi-stranded thread of continuities which inhabit successive forms in Shelley's unfolding development as a poet. It is the expressive counterpart of his abiding interest in the notion of a higher reality transmitted through forms which are themselves impermanent. The interest takes many forms. There is, for example, the phrase pure anticipated cognition that crops up several times over a number of years in different contexts, and perhaps most famously in Shelley's own playful note to Peter Bell III. Pure anticipated cognition, as Jack Donovan has very well explained, is a phrase that identifies a fundamental principle of Immanuel Kant's metaphysics. The principle that the mind possesses certain kinds of knowledge independently of any direct experience of the phenomena from which that knowledge might appear to derive. Shelley would have come across it early in Sir William Drummond's Academical Questions, where the phrase is used in the context of an attack on Kant's unchristian theories. The idea of a pure anticipated cognition seems to have been some kind of standing joke among Shelley's friends, notably Peacock, who uses the exact expression in his portraits of Shelley in Melincourt and Nightmare Abbey. There's a good discussion of it in Hugh Roberts' book Shelley and the Chaos of History. It's important to register, very important to register, the playful nature of Shelley's use of the phrase, because particularly in his later years, all philosophical positions are best understood as material for metaphor rather than credos of belief. Shelley wrote in a letter to Leigh Hunt of June 1822 that he thought Jane Williams, by now she's a most delightful person, he thought that she was such an exact antitype of the lady described in The Sensitive Plant that the character in that poem must have been a pure anticipated cognition of Jane, as the poem was written a year before he met her, although, in fact, Medwin had described her in a letter predating the composition of The Sensitive Plant, so Shelley may have been unconsciously influenced by that. The interesting thing is Shelley's easy assumption that actual experience, material reality, living persons in time, could be thought of as the vehicles of a transcendent reality, not directly knowable, but inferable from consciousness. There's a curious remark in one of his letters to John Gisborne which bears on this habit of mind in him. When speaking of his immersion in the Greek dramatists and Plato, he writes, "Some of us have, in a prior existence, been in love with an Antigone, and that makes us find no full content in any mortal tie." This remark from October 1821 takes us right back to Shelley's Oxford days, when, according to Hogg, he stopped a woman with a child in her arms on Magdalen Bridge and said to her, "Will your baby tell us anything about pre-existence, madam?" As Hogg tells the story, Shelley is, as usual, made to look ridiculous. But there is presumably some kernel of truth in Hogg's recollection, which goes on to have Shelley say that all knowledge is reminiscence, a doctrine more ancient than the times of Plato. Shelley's interest in Pythagoreanism and its Platonic and Neoplatonic adaptations is well attested. Plato's doctrine of recollection argues that things perceived through our senses remind us of things we knew before birth, when the soul was out of the body and could therefore perceive things, reality, directly. It is thus from recollection that we derive our intuition of the beautiful and the good. And this concept of a higher experience cloudily mediated for living beings leads to the related concept of metempsychosis, or the transmigration of souls. A passing mention in Medwin's Conversations of Lord Byron is one of many confirmations that metempsychosis was another preoccupation for Shelley. Medwin reports Byron defending the Catholic idea of purgatory to Shelley as a comfortable doctrine, and then saying it's an improvement on the transmigration, Shelley, which all your wiseacre philosophers taught. Medwin, of course, is no more reliable than Hogg, but there seems no reason for him to have invented what must have been a frequent topic. In Neoplatonists such as Porphyry, building on Platonic arguments in the Republic, the Meno and the Phaedrus, the doctrine of transmigration was developed to include the idea that we, and indeed the whole world, will be reborn into lives that are exactly the same as those we are now living and have already lived. After certain periods of time, the things that have happened once happen again, and nothing is ever absolutely new. We recognise the ideas as lying behind one of Shelley's greatest lyric passages in Hellas. Worlds on worlds are rolling ever from creation to decay, like the bubbles on a river sparkling, bursting, borne away. But they are still immortal, who through birth's orient portal and death's dark chasm hurrying to and fro, clothe their unceasing flight in the brief dust and light gathered around their chariots as they go. New shapes they still may weave, new gods, new laws receive, bright or dim are they as the robes they last on death's bare ribs had cast. I think we should understand the thought here as a complement to the central idea of Adonais. I've no idea when I began, actually, I'll just carry on there. We think of the thought there as a complement to the central idea of Adonais. The successive generations of human intellect confer a kind of immortality on poets, in Shelley's inclusive sense of that word in defence of poetry, creative intellect in all its forms, confer a kind of immortality by continually bringing back to affective life their achievements. This constant revivification of mind, as it hurries from successive births to deaths, weaving new shapes, can be celebrated, as in the Hellas chorus, or it can take a sceptical turn, as it does at the end of Hellas, and as it had previously done at the end of Prometheus Unbound, where the closing speech concedes that the endlessly cyclic character of human history will return the bad along with the good. Shelley, of course, didn't know that the early months of 1822 were to be his last. Indeed, the circumstance of his sudden accidental death poses peculiar difficulties in scholarly efforts to characterise his state of mind in 1822, as the fixity imposed by closure belies the rapid changes then happening in his work and his personal life at that time. Who knows what turn things might have taken had he returned safely to Casamagni in the middle of July, where Mary and Jane Williams were waiting for him. Certainly, in early 1822, his past selves were, as ever, haunting him. Queen Mab was pirated by William Clark in 1821. Shelley described it in a letter to his publisher in June 1821 as a poem I wrote in early youth, recollecting it as villainous trash. This tone was no doubt intended to put distance between his present self and the potentially dangerous legal consequences of being held responsible for the new edition. The early youth obscures the fact that Queen Mab had been published only 8 years previously. It reminds us how extraordinary telescoped was Shelley's career, all of it crammed into less than a decade, and 1822 being as far away from the publication of Queen Mab as 2017 is from 2009. All kinds of echoes will have been sounding for him in that last spring. With the imminent arrival of Leigh Hunt, the expected delivery of his library, the conflicted intimacy with Byron, calling back the summer of 1816, the autumn of 1818, the Williamses' children, a little boy and a baby girl, must have brought bitter memories as they played with the toddler Percy. Florence, that is, the son. The word echoes itself echoes through his writing of this period. It finds an elusively subtle inflection in When the Lamp is Shattered, where it contributes to a desolate melancholy in the expression of a love which has survived the extinction of its stimulus. When the lamp is shattered, the light in the dust lies dead. When the cloud is scattered, the rainbow's glory is shed. When the lute is broken, sweet tones are remembered not. When the lips have spoken, loved accents are soon forgot. As music and splendour survive not the lamp and the lute, the heart's echoes render no song when the spirit is mute. No song, but sad dirges like the wind through a ruined cell, or the mournful surges that ring the dead seaman's knell. Where hearts have once mingled, love first leaves the well-built nest. The weak one is singled to endure what it once possessed. O love, who bewailest the frailty of all things here, why choose you the frailest for your cradle, your home, and your bier? Its passions will rock thee as the storms rock the ravens on high. Bright reason will mock thee like the sun from a wintry sky. From thy nest every rafter will rot, and thine eagle home leave thee naked to laughter when leaves fall and cold winds come. The series of parallel statements seems to offer a structural symmetry which suggests something like formal logic, a clear-headedness reinforced by emphatic metrical regularity and strong rhymes. But this syllogistic clarity is completely undercut by the actual obscurity of the formulations, with their ambivalent syntax and opaque similitudes. This effect deepens in the third stanza, where tenor and vehicle become tangled and the grammar ambiguous, like someone struggling to keep a coherent argument going while breaking down emotionally. The effect is of a voice fighting to sound rational while betraying profound upset and distress, and anticipates the move back into the bleak clarity in the final stanza, where bright reason will mock thee like the sun from a wintry sky. What makes the poem so distinctively Shelleyan is its achievement in expressing emotional desolation verging on collapse with an ironically contrastive confidence and certainty in formal artistry. The sadness of a love that survives the extinction of its stimulus is a preoccupation of the late work known as the fragments of an unfinished drama. I'm now embarking on a particularly tedious part of this lecture. I've done my best to try and make myself clear, but then I've been saying that all my life. The Fragments of an Unfinished Drama is another work full of echoes, an example of new writing drawing on earlier work, earlier poetic conceptions and ideas, past experience. In the last 130 lines of the unfinished drama, which is nearly one half of the surviving draft, there's an account of a dream in which a childlike spirit emerges from a meteor and places a seed in soil within a pot. On waking, the dreamer discovers a new plant sprouting among her indoor plants and recounts its growth over the days and weeks as winter turns to spring into a gourd-like plant that spreads through a window and across a lawn down to the margins of a pool. Clearly the episode is symbolic, if obscurely so. The narrative of a plant nurtured carefully to health through winter to spring had already been developed in another fragmentary and unfinished poem, the Zucca, drafted probably 3 or 4 months earlier. The Zucca reinforces Shelley's recurring self-identification with vulnerable or blighted plants or flowers, which lies in part behind the conception of the sensitive plant written some 2 years earlier. He appears to have imaged his own condition, with its persisting health problems he and others considered serious and his constant emotional buffetings, imaged that condition in the image of an ailing plant, which could nevertheless be nursed back to vigorous health and new growth through the attentions of an attentive gardener. In both the Zucca and the unfinished drama, a potentially blighted plant survives and flourishes through the attentions of a female gardener who plays music to encourage the plant. We know that Jane Williams was a keen gardener, and she was, of course, also a notably accomplished musician and singer, so there seems little doubt that the evolving relationship with her was, if not the literal referent, then certainly a driving force in Shelley's workings and reworkings of that plant narrative. The unfinished drama is a puzzling and difficult work. Shelley was working on it in April 1822 during the last weeks in Pisa, 3 months before he drowned. It was conceived for performance by his immediate Pisan circle, himself, together with Mary, Edward and Jane Williams, and Edward Trelawney. All that survives are 3 roughly drafted passages, parts of which were first published in posthumous poems in 1824. Mary published a longer version in 1839, and then 20 years later Richard Garnett, in Relics of Shelley, published a further passage under the title, he gave it the title, The Magic Plant, corresponding to the passage I've just been discussing. The whole drama, so far as it survives in a single, relatively continuous, rough draft in one of Shelley's notebooks, was put together and published by William Michael Rossetti in 1870, although his ordering of lines and passages is very confused and consequently very confusing for readers. Thomas Hutchinson's Oxford edition of 1904 is closely based on Rossetti, and Geoffrey Matthews' revision of Hutchinson left the text of the unfinished drama untouched. Or it could have been one more excuse for Geoffrey not finishing it. The unfinished drama is the most substantial work by Shelley, which still awaits a reliable edition, although brilliant work by Tim Webb and especially Nora Crook has paved the way for one. The manuscript of the unfinished drama is often clear and easy to follow, but a fair proportion is very difficult rough draft with challenging cancellation, overwriting, unresolved alternate readings and illegibility. Several pages bear marginal marks, obviously indicating proposed or alternative insertion points for passages of draft which are not in the actual page sequence of the notebook, or possibly not in the notebook at all, but in other notebooks or loose sheets now lost or unidentified. It's hard to decide not just how individual lines might best be rendered by an editor, but in what order they're meant to be read. The task is made harder still because the longest section, a dialogue between two characters, is in blank verse, so there's no stanza shape or rhyme to serve as a guide. A further complicating factor is the manuscript does not name the characters, and there is a complete absence of speaker attributions. As with other of Shelley's drafts for dramas, including the translations from Calderon and Goethe and the original writing for Charles I, a change of speaker is often represented simply by a dash, and sometimes also by the positioning of text on the page, for example, to represent a metrical line which is divided among more than one speaker. That's why various speeches in the drama are attributed to different characters in different editions. Now this next bit, if you're not already asleep, now's your chance. This textual situation is complemented by a comparably bewildering set of questions relating to the plot of the unfinished drama and to the nature and meaning of its dialogue and action. Mary Shelley offered a plot summary when she published the fragments, but as Rossetti noticed, her summary doesn't square with what appears to be going on in what survives of the drama. In the longest surviving scene, two characters, a young man and a woman, are engaged in enigmatic conversation. The strangeness of their dramatic situation, or rather the difficulty of establishing the dramatic situation through the combination of its inexplicit strangeness with its textual incompleteness, makes for an effect of obscured brilliance that has affinities with one's reading experience of the triumph of life. So far as one can surmise, and when I say one I mean me, these two characters are caught up in a complex set of love relationships which one might try to unravel as follows. The woman has arrived on an island of the Indian archipelago. That's where Mary says the action is set. And this woman has been abandoned by her lover. But, as well as having been abandoned, she appears herself to have abandoned, before arriving on the island, a youth who was in love with her. She is, to quote from her own account of her situation, abandoned and abandoning. At various points in her narrative, the youth who has joined her on the island seems to recognise his own experience in what she says. That's to say, he has been abandoned by a woman he loved, who herself had been abandoned by a lover. I am asking questions afterwards, by the way. According to Mary's plot summary, another of the characters, an enchantress, has also been abandoned by her lover, a pirate. No guesses for prizes for guessing who was going to play that part. A pirate. And we can square that plot with the two-stanza lyric which opens the unfinished drama, as we have it in draft, spoken by the enchantress. So the play, as it survives, has got three characters, each one of them suffering from having been abandoned by a lover, and all sharing affinities of experience wherein the pain of being left connects with the suffering of leaving someone who loves you. Consider the following exchange. Following Nora's brilliant work, I'm in the edition we're calling the female character Zelika. Zelika is the woman. Why she's paining herself with the memory of the love that she's been lost. Why must I think how we two sat together under the green pavilion which the willow spreads on the floor of the unbroken fountain, strewn by the river springs that linger there, while muskrose leaves like flakes of crimson snow showered on us, and the dove mourned in the pines, sad prophetess of sorrow not her own. Over that islet paved with flowers and moss as soft and sweet as thoughts that die while they may be renewed forever. God of heavens, from such an islet, such a river spring, I dare not ask her if there stood upon it a pleasure dome surmounted by a crescent, with steps to the blue water. It may be that nature works in life several copies of the same lot. The woman comes in, so that the sufferers may feel another's sorrow in their own and find in friendship what they lost in love. That cannot be, says the youth. The scene recalled by the lady appears familiar to the youth, who dare not ask her if other details in his own past experience might confirm that they have both been in the same past situation and in the same place. It prompts him to wonder out loud whether there might be some power in nature that works in life several copies of the same lot, a thought completed by the woman with the speculation that the purpose of such replication of experience between apparent strangers might be to provide comfort and a surrogate in friendship for lost love, so that the sufferers may feel another's sorrow in their own and find in friendship what they lost in love. To which the youth replies, that cannot be. I think he says that because as the scene progresses, it becomes clear that there is a strange ambivalence about this replication of love relationship, in that it seems a possibility in the mind of the youth, but not of the lady, that their situations may not only be similar, but identical. That is to say, that he is the youth, abandoned by the woman with whom he is talking on the island. Later in the scene, the youth, having once again recognised that his situation may not be simply similar to the woman's story, but the very same story, reflects bitterly on the pervasive congruence between human love affairs. One curse of nature stamps in the same mould the fortunes of the wretched, and they see the same sad farce by many actors played as like as violet to violet, among spring flowers that fade in midsummer, when memory, the ghost, their odour keeps mid its cold relics of abandoned joy. What a beautiful line, as like as violet to violet, as an iambic pentameter. Extraordinary, isn't it? Now, this passage, beautifully representative of Shelley's style in his last months. The familiar rapidity of movement and luxuriant proliferating metaphors, a kind of chastened clarity, a subdued melancholy, a new sense of sobering realities, met by the wry recognition of limitations and disappointed aspiration. There's that word abandoned again, in a subtle figure likening the memory of lost love to the lingering odour from a flower which is itself all but dead, the material thing just a cold relic of joy abandoned by its cause. The atmosphere of the scene suggests the last months in Pisa and at Casamagni, Mary often unhappy, harassed by her father, still depressed by the loss of her children, sometimes unwell, and who knows what charge of meaning the fact that she was pregnant again was carrying for them all. While Shelley's feelings for Jane Williams, living with Edward in an apartment immediately adjacent in the same building, were beginning to run deeper and, one senses, less controllably with each passing week. The unfinished drama is shot through with echoes. The word itself echoes repeatedly, as in the opening lyric, which invokes the assistance of echo with a capital E to call back the memory of lost love, only to reflect that the heart has a music which echoes lips, though tender and true, yet can answer not. Echo as memory, and memory cannot revive abandoned love. The heart's music does not survive the removal of its stimulus. Geoffrey Matthews conjectured that those lines just quoted from the forbidden drama were a cue for the lyric, "When the lamp is shattered." That lyric is rough drafted at the same place in the notebook and was probably conceived as a song for the play, which one imagines was to alternate dramatic exchanges in blank verse with short songs in complex measures in the manner of The Tempest. Another famous late lyric, "One word is too often profaned," was almost certainly also written for the drama, as indeed were a number of other late fragments. The unfinished drama's preoccupation with human experience, which repeats across time and people, takes us back to Shelley's persisting interest in metempsychosis, the transmigration of souls. A transhistorical commonality in human experience presents a paradox. It is at once the basis of our sympathy with other minds, and hence our capacity for altruism, but it also confirms the perennial and irremediable essentials of the human condition. The theme of transmigration reappears in one of the most subtle and sophisticated of Shelley's late lyrics, With a Guitar to Jane. It's a poem again thronged with literary echoes, the metre of Comus and the Tempest, the courtly idiom of a poem accompanying a gift, suggesting verses by Herrick and Donne. The poem's ambiguous voice, whereby Shelley speaks in the person of Ariel as to Miranda, but with a clear reference throughout to his relationship with Jane and Edward Williams and Mary, enables a teasing directness moderated by the implied dramatic distance. It's important to grasp the poem's fundamental conception in a playful pattern of relaxedly erudite allusion to Pythagorean and Platonic doctrines of metempsychosis and of the mediation for humans of the universal harmony through the agency of music. The guitar knew that seldom heard mysterious sound which, driven on its diurnal round as it floats through boundless day, our world enkindles on its way. This touches on the Pythagorean doctrine of a harmony in the tuning, the Greek word is harmonia, of the universe, a chord comprising the sounds emitted by the sun, moon, planets and fixed stars, which corresponds to a potential harmony inside the human being, obstructed by gross matter for all of us living mortals, but for us accessible through music. Post-Platonic commentary developed the idea into the music of the spheres, and in the post-classical era the concept was Christianized, famously, for example, in Dryden's Song for St. Cecilia's Day, as the diapason closing full in man. The body of the guitar Shelley gave to Jane was made from pine wood, and the poem consequently plays on the idea that in its previous existence as a pine tree it has heard this universal harmony. The conceit of reincarnation is what knits together the elements of the lyric. Thus Shelley, as the speaker of the poem, is the reincarnation of the spirit Ariel, and Jane and Edward the reincarnations of Miranda and Ferdinand, aligning them with the spirit of the guitar as the reincarnation of the spirit that inhabited the tree from which it is made. These identifications are made to elide for the reader, as Shelley further implies a parallel between the guitar's responsiveness to a skilled musician and his own responsiveness under the stimulus of Jane, which in its turn serves as an image for the poet's relation to his audience. The poem springs back into effective life in the mind of a receptive reader, just as an instrument is meaningless inert matter until touched to music in the hands of a skilled performer. The idea echoes Shelley's translation of the Homeric hymn to Mercury, with its lyre, which has a transformative power in the hands of the right musician. For those endowed with art and wisdom who interrogate, it teaches, babbling in delightful mood, all things which make the spirit most elate, soothing the mind with sweet familiar play, chasing the heavy shadows of dismay. This informing conceit in With a Guitar is an inflection of the affirmation that drives the closing stanzas of Adonais, the idea that poets are immortal in the sense that their work is continually reborn as it quickens to new life in fresh generations of readers. Splendours of the firmament of time may be eclipsed, but are extinguished not. Like stars, to their appointed height they climb, and death is a low mist which cannot blot the brightness it may veil. When lofty thought lifts a young heart above its mortal lair, and love and life contend in it, for what shall be its earthly doom, the dead live there, and move like winds of light on dark and stormy air. Shelley has been proved right in his vision of Keats's immortality, in this sense. But Adonais' assertion of Keats's greatness depends for its efficacy on Shelley's poem itself outlasting time. And so it has proved to do. He has lived and lives in the minds of his readers. He lived through the Chartists and the Fabians. He lived in the writings of the International Left and the speeches of Mahatma Gandhi. British Labour politics has always turned to him, as indeed it did centrally in the most recent general election in that rallying slogan, for the many, not the few. He lives through his influence on the work of poets and thinkers. He lives through the work of the scholars who have secured the transmission of his text through time, and through the commentary of critics who interpret afresh for new generations in their new worlds. This conference can take its place in this continuing history. It's the conception and creation of young academics, and one in particular, at the very start of a career, carried through with hard work and careful planning, but also with accessible enthusiasm and real panache. This event is a kind of reincarnation in itself, breathing new life into a series that began back in 1978, nearly 40 years ago, with a country house conference in West Wales. The house was called Gwynnog. There were further conferences there in 1980 and 1992, and that bicentenary year, there was also a memorable event in New York. Now this new conference brings together established Shelleyians with young scholars in a celebration of Shelley's and Mary's extraordinary creative and intellectual legacy. I, for one, find its enthusiasm and energy not just heartening, but moving, and its testimony to a persisting intelligence and sanity and optimism, a flowering isle in today's bizarre and unsettling world. It seems fitting to end by returning to my beginning, with the final stanza of The Cloud. I am the daughter of earth and water, and the nursling of the sky. I pass through the pores of the ocean and shores. I change, but I cannot die. For after the rain, when with never a stain the pavilion of heaven is bare, and the winds and sunbeams with their convex gleams build up the blue dome of air, I silently laugh at my own cenotaph, and out of the caverns of rain, like a child from the womb, like a ghost from the tomb, I arise and unbuild it again.